The year was 303 AD, and the streets of Chalcedon trembled under the weight of whispers. Whispers of death, of disappearances, of names spoken once and never again. The Roman Empire, once tolerant of religious variation, was now gripped by a cold, calculated purge war on the Christians that would leave thousands mutilated, buried, burned, or erased. At the head of this campaign stood Emperor Diocletian, whose rule brought not only reform but repression. Rome was fracturing, internally torn between East and West, faith and fear. The old gods of Jupiter and Mars were being challenged by a strange new monotheism spreading through the cities like a disease, Christianity. It offered love, but demanded loyalty not to Caesar, but to Christ. That alone made it dangerous to Diocletian and his advisors. Christianity wasn't just heresy, it was treason. And treason had to bleed. Edicts were issued from Nicomedia. Churches were burned to ash. Scriptures were confiscated and destroyed. The year was 303 AD, and the streets of Chalcedon trembled under the weight of whispers. Whispers of death, of disappearances, of names spoken once and never again. The Roman Empire, once tolerant of religious variation, was now gripped by a cold, calculated purge war on the Christians that would leave thousands mutilated, buried, burned, or erased. At the head of this campaign stood Emperor Diocletian, whose rule brought not only reform but repression. Rome was fracturing, internally torn between East and West, faith and fear. The old gods of Jupiter and Mars were being challenged by a strange new monotheism spreading through the cities like a disease, Christianity. It offered love, but demanded loyalty not to Caesar, but to Christ. That alone made it dangerous to Diocletian and his advisors. Christianity wasn't just heresy, it was treason. And treason had to bleed. Edicts were issued from Nicomedia. Churches were burned to ash. Scriptures were confiscated and destroyed. Anyone caught worshiping in secret could expect arrest, torture, or execution. The more theatrical, the better. Chalcedon, perched on the edge of the Bosporus, was meant to be a tranquil port. Instead, it became a stage. That was on that stage, under the hot Anatolian sun, that a 15-year-old girl named Euphemia would be paraded, punished, and ultimately immortalized. She did not carry weapons. She did not lead armies. All she had was a fragile body, a quiet voice, and a belief in something unseen. But in the eyes of the empire, that was enough to mark her for destruction. Euphemia wasn't born to die like this. She came from nobility, a patrician family, Roman by law, but Greek in soul. Her father was a magistrate, her mother a quiet intellectual. In their home, religion was something practiced with precision sacrifices, idols, public piety. But Euphemia was different. She was drawn to the shadows, to the whispers of the underground Christian gatherings that met under moonlight in basements behind locked doors, where bread and wine weren't for feast, but for symbol. Where love didn't come from conquest, but from sacrifice. It was there beneath stone chapels, hidden beneath the feet of soldiers, that she found something Rome couldn't give her. Stillness. They said she was delicate, pale, with a face too calm to belong to a girl of 15, but behind those eyes was steel. She had memorized the Psalms, learned the names of martyrs, studied the book of Revelation as though it were her future, and when the time came, when the soldiers smashed through the door of her gathering and dragged her and 48 others into the dirt, she didn't scream. She didn't resist. Not because she was broken, but because she was ready to the authorities. She was a mere child, soft, impressionable, easily reformed. A good public whipping, maybe a stint in the dungeons, and she'd denounce Christ like so many before her. That was the plan, but Euphemia didn't break. She refused to confess, refused to recant, and worse. She smiled. That frightened them more than any sword. So they made a new plan. She would become an example. Her death wouldn't just silence her, would teach others to stay quiet, to bow, to burn their scriptures and keep their prayers to themselves. But Euphemia, born of grace, was now destined for agony. Not because she deserved it, but because the empire feared what she represented. Ungovernable conviction wrapped in a young girl's skin. It began with a list, 50 names, scribbled in ink, then scratched in blood. Euphemia's was the last. These were the Christians of Chalcedon, charged under Diocletian's edicts with defying the gods of Rome for participating in illegal worship, for refusing to offer incense to the emperor, for believing above all else that there was one God only and he did not wear a laurel crown. The trials were a farce. They didn't need evidence. They didn't even need confessions. Names alone were guilt enough. The court was a spectacle. Magistrates in red robes, jeering crowds, and trembling prisoners who would either kiss the statue of Jupiter or face the whip. Some broke. Most did. The sun had barely risen when they dragged her from her cell. She was naked. Not metaphorically, humiliatingly bare. Her body already bruised from the earlier beatings. Her ankles chained. Her wrists bound behind her back so tightly the skin had split. They paraded her through the streets of Chalcedon like meat for market. But Euphemia did not lower her eyes. She walked upright to the people. She was a curiosity, spectacle, a whisper in the crowd. That's her. A girl who spat on Jupiter. Say she laughed when the priest cursed her. And then they brought out the hooks, iron, barbed, designed not just to tear flesh, but to drag it. They tied her to a wooden frame, arms spread like wings. With each swing of the hook, a scream. Not hers, theirs. The torturers were afraid of her silence. She bit down on her tongue to keep herself from crying out. First, they tore at her back, then her thighs, then her stomach. Strips of red blooming down her sides as if her body had become a flag of defiance. And still, she whispered prayers, not curses, not names, prayers. They beat her with rods until bones cracked, poured vinegar into her wounds, pressed burning metal to her skin. And when she finally collapsed from blood loss, they didn't say she broke. They said she ascended. But Euphemia hadn't died yet. No, this was just the beginning, because next, it would try to feed her to something that felt no mercy. The pit. Stank of rot and dried blood. It was the kind of smell that clung to your lungs like old death left to ferment in the heat. Euphemia was dragged through the arena gates, her body broken, but not dead. She wasn't meant to die quickly. That would be mercy. The Romans had something else planned. They would feed her to the beasts. It was a ritual of spectacle, a performance dressed as punishment. Citizens poured into the amphitheater, their faces smeared with wine and sweat, cheering as if they'd come for theater, not execution. But there was a silence when they saw her. A girl barely 17, wrapped in her own blood, standing in the middle of a sunlit arena with her arms outstretched like a crucifix walking. Then came the lions. Two of them. Lean with hunger, their ribs sharp against golden fur. The gates creaked open and the crowd braced for the screams, but none came. The lions padded toward her, sniffed her blood, and then stopped. One sat, the other bowed its head. They did not bite, they did not roar, they refused her. The crowd gasped. The executioner hesitated. Some murmured that she was protected by God. Others spat that she was a sorceress. The magistrate watching from above turned pale, because lions, by law and nature, do not spare prey. But Euphemia. She stood, trembling and torn apart, and whispered one word through bloodied lips. Amen. It wasn't victory. It was proof, a sign that she had not been broken. Not by hooks, not by chains. Not even by death's most primal instruments. And now, the court had a dilemma. How do you kill a girl already anointed by miracle? Their answer? Make her rot. Slowly, they didn't lift her from the arena. They left her there naked, flayed, forgotten. The lions had walked away, but the audience had. Neither had the guards. And for hours, Euphemia lay curled in the sand as the sun beat down on her raw flesh. The grit of the arena sticking to her wounds like salt in a wound at first. They thought she would die within the hour. She didn't by nightfall. Her breath was shallow but present by dawn. She had sat up. It terrified them to the authorities. Euphemia was no longer a heretic. She was something worse. A story, a sign. People began to murmur outside the prison that the lions had seen a saint, that she had walked into the mouth of death and been spit out untouched. So they did what tyrants always do with miracles they can't control. They buried. Alive, not ceremonially, not even with dignity. They took her half dead, bundled her in cloth-like garbage, and sealed her in a tomb beneath a Roman storehouse near Chalcedon. No last rites. No grave marker. Just stone, silence, and the dark. And that's where she died, not on a cross, not in flames, but in a sealed box of air, where each breath cost more than the last, and the screams she had once silenced finally clawed their way out. No one heard them, but history remembers, because sometimes saints don't rise in golden light. Sometimes they rot under the weight of a cowardly empire, proof that martyrdom is not glory, but horror endured with grace. And Euphemia. She endured everything. Should have been bones. When they opened Euphemia's tomb years later under secret orders from a bishop seeking evidence of her martyrdom, they expected decay. Dust, maybe fragments of cloth, but that is not what they found. They found her intact flesh. Like pale wax, eyes shut, mouth closed, as if merely asleep. Her wounds had not festered. Her limbs had not curled in the posture of a woman suffocating. She lay peacefully, naturally so. Whispers spread instantly. Word reached Constantinople that a miracle had been unearthed. That Euphemia, the flayed girl the lions refused to eat, had not truly died, or had not stayed dead. Some swore the air in the tomb had smelled of roses. Others claimed they saw her fingers, twitched on in the chaos of a fractured church in a world where dogma meant war. The discovery of Euphemia's body became more than a curiosity. It became a weapon, because if she had truly been spared by lions, if her body defied rot, then her faith had not been wrong. Hers had been divine. And the men who buried her, drenched in sin, suddenly, Euphemia's silence was louder than their sermons, and the empire was listening. The church wanted her bones, the emperor wanted control, and the people, they wanted a miracle to believe in. Saint Euphemia, once a forgotten corpse buried beneath a market floor, was now a living argument in a war of faiths. In the early 5th century, as the Eastern Roman Empire fractured over doctrinal disputes, her body, her untouched, unratted, impossible body, became a rallying cry. The question that divided bishops and emperors alike wasn't whether Euphemia had died. It was, what did she die for? The Council of Chalcedon, one of the most pivotal gatherings in Christian history, was held just steps from the site of her martyrdom. A theological knife fight disguised as diplomacy. It sought to define what Christ was fully divine. Fully human. Both. Neither side could agree. But Euphemia was there. Her relics were brought into the council chamber, and the legend goes, when the opposing factions placed their doctrines before her shrine, only one was accepted: the scroll of the Chalcedonian Creed. The other was found discarded, thrown to the floor as if by unseen hands. Whether myth or manipulation, didn't matter. What mattered was that this flayed girl, tortured in silence, buried without name, was now the voice of orthodoxy. A voice that couldn't be refuted. Because what could they say? She was wrong. She was dead, and still she spoke. They took her bones apart piece by piece, as if slicing through memory. First, her skull was enshrined in a golden reliquary, paraded through streets slick with rain and incense smoke. Then her rib fragments, her teeth, even scraps of the garments she may have died in, all scattered to churches like sacred ammunition. Saint Euphemia had become a relic empire, but somewhere in that gilded spectacle, the horror of her death. Nakedness, the iron hooks, the open wounds left to rot, was softened, blurred, turned into perfume. They didn't speak of the screams anymore, only of the miracles. They didn't describe the bruises or the terror in her eyes, only the roses, the light in her tomb. It's the hand of God. But you can still find her, not just in the golden churches of Greece or the ossuaries in Istanbul. You can find her in the walls, in the paintings where her breasts are exposed, not with shame, but with strange, reverent A.W. In the stories where a lion bowed its head rather than eat her dot, and in the silence between verses where no one asks why a teenage girl was stripped, chained, and torn apart for refusing to recite a line. Saint Euphemia was made holy because she refused to speak, but her silence was not peace, it was pain weaponized. Her body became a banner, her suffering a doctrine, and long after her voice was stolen, long after her skin was bruised into oblivion, they called her a saint because that's what history does best, sanctifies. This screams. They called her a martyr, but what she endured stripped naked, torn by iron, drowned in blood, and silence was not just sacrifice, it was ritualized cruelty, drenched in ceremony and twisted into meaning. Saint Euphemia didn't die for a cause. She was used by one. Her body became a battleground between emperors and bishops, truth and heresy, faith and control. Her blood spilled not just onto the sands of the arena, but into the veins of an entire empire, shaping theology with the image of a broken teenage girl who would not kneel. And centuries later, she still doesn't. In art, she's often shown standicam, luminous, holy. But beneath that sanctified brushwork lies the girl who screamed into the dirt, felt hooks tear her skin, was left to rot beneath a city that only later decided she mattered. So when we remember her, let's not remember the roses. Let's remember the room she died in, the scent of sweat and rust, the silence of onlookers, the hands that beat her, the hooks that tore her, the prayers she refused to change. Because the true horror wasn't just her death, it was the ease with which they erased her pain and rewrote it as virtue, and that. How power survives, not with swords, with stories. Have you ever heard of a darker canonization than this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more untold horrors buried under empires and sanctified in silence, don't forget to subscribe. We have more truths to dig up.